pick up on that phrase, extreme weather conditions. And climate change not only results in a devastating loss of species, it can also threaten farming, rising temperatures affecting rainfall and seasonal patterns on a global scale. And all of that, I would suggest to you, has a severe impact on food security going forward. So here's the question, just how worried should we be? Let me take you live to Cape Town. Peter Johnson is a climate scientist and researcher at the University of Cape Town. Peter Johnson, good morning to you and welcome. Before we get to food security and agriculture, we've just played a piece on the flooding in KwaZulu-Natal. You would have been aware of the twin tornadoes that hit the province a little earlier this week as well. Was this out of the ordinary, do you think?
So, sorry, repeat the question, Jeremy.
My question to you is the tornado that we witnessed in KwaZulu-Natal at the weekend, as well as the flooding. Is this anything out of the ordinary?
No, not really. You know, the KwaZulu-Natal is subject to quite violent storms, as is the rest of the country. And the formation of tornadoes is quite normal when we get what we call a supercell development, and very strong updrafts and downdrafts in a thundercloud. But it's impossible to predict, and one just has to kind of look at the frequency of these tornadoes. They're random, they occur, you know, all of a sudden, and we don't know where they're going to occur. So we've had tornadoes in our history. It's not that common, but when it does happen, it causes devastation, and because it's unusual, it hits the news, you know, and is quite out of the ordinary.
Let me get to the point as to why we invited you onto the program in the first place. And it's been written that, and you're responsible for this, that farmers understand that not every year is going to be profitable, but over the long run, all things being equal, the good years should outnumber the bad. It sounds like a biblical parable. But that paradigm in terms of climate change has altered, has it not? And that is having an impact, or a potential impact at least, on agriculture.
Yes, absolutely. So what we've been detecting is that more and more farmers are complaining and saying that the weather's changing, and then they say the climate is changing. So two things need to happen. The first thing is we need to hear exactly what they mean. Are they talking about a longer-term situation, or are they just talking about recent years? And then the second thing we need to do is to compare it to the actual data. And what we're seeing is that there's a cyclical nature to agriculture and to climate, if you like. We get, you know, wet periods and dry periods. But what the farmers are saying, and what the data is suggesting, is that increasing temperatures are a fact. And these increasing temperatures lead to two things. One is that they lead to more extreme events. So when it is hot, it's very hot, and it's very hot for longer. And the second thing that we see is changing rainfall patterns. And that's quite concerning because, you know, when farmers are faced with high temperatures, they say, okay, it's a heat wave, we can deal with it as long as the rain comes. And then when we find that rainfall patterns are changing, what is happening is that the whole normal situation seems to be changing. So farmers are now faced with you know, different situations that they don't really know how to handle, and they're wondering what normal really is and whether they are going to be able to get those 5 good years against the 3 bad years and the 2 sort of break-even years, which was what we talk about. So the rising temperatures, you know, have a direct impact on their crops and a direct impact on their crop yields, as do the changing rainfall patterns.
And the concern, surely, is that because temperatures, I understand, are increasing in southern Africa faster than the worldwide average, we need to act perhaps quicker rather than we're doing right now.
Yes, so that acting quicker is quite interesting. So what do farmers do? One of the things they do is they say, all right, we'll try and find drought-resistant seed or seed that's more resistant to temperature. We'll take some action. If we're growing fruit trees, we'll put up shade cloth. You know, various things they can do. But if you're growing maize or wheat in an open field and you are subject to the conditions, there's not a lot you can do. So farmers, when the rain comes late, they plant late. But if they're planting late, they're planting so that the season is heading right into the hottest part. And their growing season is exposed to these very high temperatures. So, you know, they wonder if this is a catch-22 situation, because what can they actually do? So we're suggesting a couple of things, and one of the things is for them to look at the existing crop and decide whether it's becoming really profitable or marginal. If it's becoming marginal, it means that it's not really the ideal conditions to grow that crop. Now, traditionally, many farmers say, well, we only grow maize, and that's what we're going to do forever, and we will continue doing so. And because they're locked into some sort of market system where they sell their maize to a market, and that's the way they trade, and that's the way their inputs and their implements are organized, it's quite hard for them to change. But we are saying two things. First of all, analyze those marginal crops and see if there are perhaps other crops that would grow better and make you as much, if not more, money under these changing conditions. And the second thing to do is to diversify, to get more livestock if you can, try and grow some pastures if you can, try and look at alternative crops, try and use the existing water that you have to the maximum advantage, and see if there's another way that you can kind of hedge your farming system so that you are covered when the climate or the weather systems aren't what you expect.
Peter, given that maize is a staple in this country, what type of alternative crops would we be talking about in order to give that financial return to farmers in the first place?
Well, that's the thing, you see, because we're kind of committed to a maize industry in the fact that, many people eat maize, and maize is used in a myriad of industries. Half the maize we produce goes to cattle feed. And that is, that's not limited to maize. We could grow a number of things to feed cattle. It's just that because we're used to growing maize, that's what we do. The white maize that we grow that goes for human food, that can be obtained from other countries. So it's not a case of, we have to grow that. It's very nice to grow it ourselves, and it's very nice to have that sort of food security. But more and more people are eating other things. They're eating more wheat, they're eating more rice. Now, we can't grow enough wheat to sustain our needs, and we certainly don't grow much rice. So the alternative foods we're looking at are things like legumes, lentils, chickpeas, different types of ground nuts, different types of beans, and these are high-protein foods. The trouble is people aren't used to eating them. When last did you have a lentil? It's not a case of we have these things every day. So there's a dual nature of the system. One is to look at alternative crops that are going to grow well and produce a good crop but can be sold. And in order for them to be sold, we need to find a market. And I think what we need to do is nutritionists and farming people need to look at alternative crops and say, well, let's try and introduce these into our diets. They're more nutritious, they grow better, they're more resistant to the high temperatures, and perhaps they might be an alternative for the future. But it's not going to happen overnight. So what we're suggesting is let's do more research, let's do more field trials, let's introduce these alternative crops little by little and see if they are an alternative. We're certainly not going to dictate to farmers to say you must do this. But if they turn out and find out that maize farming is not profitable anymore, then this may be a sustainable option.
Peter Johnson, all across South Africa, I can hear vegans saying, we told you so. But let's park that for the moment. You also make the point that resilience needs to be built up through, and I quote, measured and effective response. You've just outlined that. But who takes the lead here? Is there a good enough, an effective enough macro strategy to start looking at some of the suggestions that you're making?
That's a very touchy subject, Jeremy, because the traditional farming system is very much chemically based in South Africa. And what we've got is a very strong lobby and a very strong market-orientated production of crops, which we sometimes feel is not sustainable. So in order to become resilient to climate change and environmental change in general, we need to do two things. One is to look at our crop very critically and saying, can we continue doing this? Can we continue depending on chemicals in the way that we have been doing so far? And the ecologist answer is no. We've got to look after our soil. We've got to look after our water. So let's focus on those two things. And that becomes a more biological type of farming. And we're trying to say that biological farming is much more resilient to the stresses that we're facing, and perhaps we should be heading in that direction. Now, vegetarian or not, or vegan or not, isn't really the point. There's a place for livestock and meat in the South African milieu, if you like, and there's a place for grains. But we must look at them holistically and saying, what is the best and sustainable solution for our food security in the future? And perhaps that isn't a preponderance of maize. That's really all we're saying. We're thinking of the farmers, we're thinking of their resilience, we're thinking of their survival. And what we're trying to suggest is maybe it's time to look at alternatives.
All right, a critical debate live in Cape Town on this Saturday morning. Peter Johnson, climate scientist at the University of Cape Town. When we continue.